Ever wonder how those huge government contracts get decided? You know, the ones for bridges and buildings, that kind of thing. We're talking serious money here, folks.
Absolutely. It's a world of high-stakes bidding.
Exactly. And today, we're taking a deep dive into procurement auctions. Specifically, we're looking at those systems designed to give the little guy a fighting chance. Do they actually work?
It's a question that's more relevant than ever, especially when you look at governments trying to support certain industries or businesses. We're focusing on subsidies in this deep dive. You know, those financial boosts some companies get to level the playing field. Are they as effective as they seem?
And the best part is, we're not just talking theory here.
Right, we've got real-world data to dig into.
Exactly. This study, helping hampered bidders do subsidy auctions work as intended, they actually use data from Department of Transportation auctions.
So we're talking real companies bidding on real contracts. This is the real deal.
As real as it gets. Now, this study really digs into the nitty-gritty of how these auctions actually play out.
And what's fascinating is it goes beyond those traditional economic models.
You know, the ones that assume everyone's perfectly rational, like robots just crunching numbers to find the absolute best move.
Right, but anyone who's ever gotten caught up in a bidding war knows things aren't quite that simple.
Yeah.
Human behavior is a bit more, shall we say, complicated.
Oh yeah, tell me about it. That auction fever is real. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's define who we mean by these disadvantaged bidders.
Sure, so think smaller businesses.
Okay.
Those might be businesses owned by minorities or even companies in newer industries that the government wants to give a leg up to, like renewable energy, for example.
Makes sense.
They often face higher costs or just don't have the same resources as those big established companies, which puts them at a disadvantage when it comes to competing for these massive contracts.
It's like bringing a knife to a bulldozer fight, as they say. So how do you even begin to level that playing field?
Well, there are a few ways to approach it. Set-asides, for instance, where the government basically reserves specific contracts just for these disadvantaged bidders.
Okay.
Then you have price preferences. That's essentially a discount that lets disadvantaged bidders win, even if their bid isn't the absolute lowest.
Right.
But our focus today is on subsidies, which is directly giving a company money if they win the contract.
Subsidies, that classic helping hand, but I'm guessing it's not quite as straightforward as it seems.
You're catching on. With subsidies, there's this whole other layer of human behavior that comes into play, and it gets pretty interesting. There's this classic model by Rothkopf and colleagues from back in 2003. They tried to predict how these auctions should play out, you know, assuming everyone's acting completely rationally.
Right.
And their model basically said that bidders would just add a percentage markup to their costs just to make sure they'd be making a profit.
Okay. Seems logical enough, at least on paper.
Absolutely. But what's really interesting is this new research found something they call the convergence effect.
Convergence effect, huh?
Basically, the idea is that as those subsidies increase, disadvantaged bidders get more competitive.
Right. Makes sense. They've got more skin in the game.
Exactly. And that, in turn, pushes the bigger, more established companies to get more aggressive with their bids, too.
So it's like a subsidy-fueled bidding war.
Precisely. And what the researchers found is that this effect does happen, just not quite as neatly as that 2003 model predicted. It turns out both types of bidders got way more aggressive than expected, which led to some surprisingly low bids for the government.
Wow, so taxpayers actually benefit from this subsidy-fueled frenzy. Who knew? But hold on. What about the whole point of helping those disadvantaged companies? How did they fare in all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. See, on the one hand, subsidies did help increase profits for those disadvantaged sellers, which is what we want, right?
Right, that's the goal.
But here's the catch. Because everyone was bidding so aggressively, some of those disadvantaged sellers actually ended up winning contracts where they were losing money.
Ouch. Winning the contract but digging themselves into a hole. Not exactly a recipe for success.
Not at all. And that actually brings us to another fascinating thing the researchers discovered. This idea of a framing effect.
Okay, framing effect. I'm intrigued. Does this mean that even just the way information is presented, you know, how the deal's framed, can change how people bid?
You hit the nail on the head. They found that simply changing how bidders input their bids, whether as a straight dollar amount or a percentage markup, could actually significantly change their behavior. It's almost as if our brains don't always treat dollars and percentages the same way, even when it's the same amount of money.
So how we see those numbers, how it's presented to us, can actually change how we feel about the numbers themselves. Wild. It really makes you wonder about all the ways that framing pops up in everyday life. But let's get back to these auctions. How did this whole dollar versus percentage thing actually play out in the study?
Well, they found that disadvantaged bidders were much more aggressive when they used dollar amounts for their bids. But here's the thing, it was really only for those larger contracts. It's almost like seeing those big dollar signs made them more comfortable with a smaller profit margin, as long as they were able to snag the deal.
Interesting. So what about the bigger, more established companies? Did seeing those dollar signs make them more likely to open up their wallets?
You'd think so, right? But no, not really. They actually got more aggressive with the smaller contracts when they were using those percentages. It's almost as if they were thinking, okay, let's just lock this one down quickly, even if the dollar amount isn't that huge.
So everyone's got their own bidding style, depending on the size of the contract and how they're looking at the numbers. It really drives home the point that those perfectly rational bidders we see in those economic models, they might not actually exist in the real world.
Absolutely. Human psychology just adds this whole other layer of complexity. And speaking of which, remember those price preference auctions we talked about earlier? The ones where the government essentially gives disadvantaged bidders a discount.
Right.
Well, this study actually compared them head-to-head with subsidies, and the results are pretty interesting.
Okay, so same goal, trying to give those disadvantaged bidders a leg up, but using two different approaches. What did they find?
Here's the thing. Sellers were actually much less aggressive when they were dealing with subsidies, particularly those partial subsidies compared to price preferences.
Hold on, so you're saying that when those disadvantaged bidders knew they had a guaranteed chunk of change coming their way, they actually bid higher than when they just had a discount factored in? That doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't they go all in when they know there's extra cash on the table?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But again, I think it goes back to that framing effect we talked about earlier. With a subsidy, even though it's a guaranteed payout if they win, those bidders have to actually do a bit of mental gymnastics. They have to figure out, okay, how do I factor that subsidy into my bid? And that can get a little tricky.
Yeah, it's like trying to calculate a tip after you've had a big meal. Sometimes you just throw your hands up and hope for the best.
Exactly. But with a price preference, the buyer is taking care of all those calculations. The disadvantaged bidder sees that discount right up front, and they can just focus on their costs and their overall strategy. It's just a lot less mental work.
So even though it seems like there's more potential for profit with a big, juicy subsidy, the mental effort of figuring it all out might actually make bidders a little more hesitant. They end up playing it safer.
That's the idea. It seems like having to do that extra mental math with subsidies might actually lead to disadvantaged bidders being more cautious in their bidding, which results in higher bids overall.
Fascinating. So those price preferences, while they might seem more straightforward on the surface, they might actually create this super competitive environment where everyone's slashing prices to the bone, which could actually end up hurting everyone involved. Talk about unintended consequences.
It's a real concern. And it really speaks to the heart of why we're doing this deep dive in the first place. We can't just look at these policies at a surface level. We have to consider the human element, the way people actually behave when money's on the line. Often, those behavioral factors have a much bigger impact than we realize.
Absolutely. It's not just about picking a number for a subsidy or a discount. There's a lot more to it than that. So for all of our listeners out there, what's the big takeaway from all this? What should we be keeping in mind? It's like those seemingly small choices about how we structure these incentives can actually snowball into these big behavioral shifts, and we don't always see them coming.
Right, exactly. It just highlights how important it is to look beyond just the surface level, especially when we're dealing with something as complex as government contracting. We've got to consider the human element, those psychological factors that can really throw a wrench into the works, even with the best intentions.
For sure. So let's say I'm a government agency and I really want to use these subsidies to make things fairer. What are some of the key takeaways from this research? What should I be thinking about?
Well, first off, I'd say don't just assume that a bigger subsidy is always going to be the better option. Remember those partial subsidies we talked about?
Right.
They might seem like a good compromise at first glance, but what this research suggests is they can actually lead to unintended consequences. You might end up in a situation where these disadvantaged bidders are winning contracts, but they're actually losing money, which defeats the whole purpose.
Because they're trying to factor in that subsidy money, but maybe not quite getting the math right, and they end up underbidding.
Exactly. So if you're really serious about helping these disadvantaged bidders, and you want to create a system where they can actually thrive, a full subsidy might actually be the more effective way to go.
Okay.
It seems a little counterintuitive, I know, but sometimes spending a little bit more up front can actually save money in the long run.
So that makes sense. It's about playing the long game, building a more sustainable system, instead of just focusing on those short-term wins. What about those price preference systems? Anything we should keep in mind about those?
Yeah, so while price preferences might seem a little bit more straightforward, it's important to remember they can sometimes create an environment that's almost too competitive.
Right.
It's like this race to the bottom where everyone's constantly trying to undercut each other just to try and secure that contract, and that can actually end up hurting everyone involved in the long run.
Right. Even those bigger companies might start to feel the squeeze with those razor-thin profit margins.
Exactly. So it's really about finding that balance, right? You want to encourage competition, of course.
All right.
But you also want to make sure the system isn't accidentally harming the very businesses that it's designed to help.
Finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. It's about crafting those policies that not only look good on paper, but they also reflect a deeper understanding of, human behavior and how we actually respond to incentives. Because sometimes it's not always as straightforward as we might think.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. We've learned that those subsidies, those helping hands, can be really effective tools for leveling the playing field, but it's definitely not as simple as just throwing money at the problem. We've got to consider those human elements, those psychological factors that are at play.
Absolutely. And we've seen how even small changes in presentation, like just how we frame those numbers, can completely change our behavior, sometimes with those unintended consequences popping up.
It makes you wonder how much the psychological factors influence us in other areas of life too, not just with these big government contracts. What about in those massive international trade deals, or even just our everyday purchases? Are we all susceptible to these framing effects without even realizing it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
It's definitely something for all of us to think about next time we're evaluating a deal or making a decision. Are we really responding to the information itself, or are we being swayed by how it's being presented to us? A little food for thought.
Definitely. Well, on that note, a huge thank you to our expert for this incredible deep dive into procurement auctions, subsidies, and the always fascinating world of human behavior. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing. Remember, there's always more to uncover when we take that deep dive.